Bethany and McLean, in your book, Shaky Ground, you discuss the plight of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Why are these GSEs so important to everyday Americans and not just hedge fund managers fighting over the remains?
Well, in the years since the financial crisis, when Fannie and Freddie, you'll recall, were taken over by the U.S. government, there would not have been a mortgage market were it not for these two companies. Some 80% of mortgages that have been made in this country have gone through those two companies. So in a sense, everyone who's gotten a mortgage, everybody who's bought or sold a house has been dependent on these two giant institutions, which few people understand. Even if you haven't gotten a mortgage, even if you're just an average investor, you should care about the fate of these two companies. These mortgage-backed securities that they issue, debt backed by the mortgages of Americans. There's about over 5 trillion of it outstanding today. It moves through the global capital markets like water. It's everywhere. It's collateral for derivative trades. It matters to your portfolio.
And it's also very partisan, because whenever you talk about Fannie and Freddie in Congress, it's a very partisan issue. So let's take a step back. Why is it such a political football?
So Fannie and Freddie have always been a political football. It's fascinating. There have always been people who have said, what is the government doing in our housing market? We are a free market economy. We're a capitalist economy. What is a government-sponsored enterprise? And so that's been one source of the anger against Fannie and Freddie. Add in the fact that their executives made a lot of money, that Fannie was a political powerhouse, the likes of which the world has almost never seen. And then add in this notion, very popular in some circles, that Fannie and Freddie were the cause of the housing price crisis. You see why these two companies are pariahs.
Can you talk about what drove it into conservatorship? It's a $187 billion rescue at the height of the financial crisis. Simply, I know there's a lot of things going on, but quite simply, what drove Fannie and Freddie bankrupt?
So they began in an effort to regain the market share they had lost to Wall Street. They began to dive into subprime, insuring subprime mortgage-backed securities, riskier mortgages at exactly the wrong time, and doing so caused them enormous losses. There was a huge loss of confidence in the two companies, and Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary at the time, felt like he needed to take them over to reassure markets that they wouldn't crack, thereby decimating global capital markets. Now, they've gone on to produce this headline number of $187 billion in losses. The fascinating thing is it's not a real number. A lot of that was non-cash losses that never materialized. And even if it was a real number, Fannie and Freddie have paid much more than that back to the government already.
So Fannie and Freddie are profitable, and one would think that these profitable enterprises could be spun out and operate in the capitalist economy. So why hasn't the government gotten rid of them yet?
I think there are a few reasons. One is the government is now addicted to Fannie and Freddie's profits as a slush fund to fuel the budget. They like having these profits, so I think that's one reason that's causing stalemate. I think another reason is there's this pretty widespread belief, not completely, but pretty widespread belief that if you don't have some sort of government presence backstopping the housing market, you would not have a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, which most Americans have come to believe is a right. So there is a sense we need to keep some sort of government backstop in the housing market. What is it if it's not Fannie and Freddie? Nobody seems to be able to agree on that.
Well, in your book, Shaky Ground, you say it's unsustainable for Fannie and Freddie to operate like this going forward. We haven't heard a lot of solutions from the presidential candidates or even the president as to what to do with these enterprises. Why not?
I think the main reason it's unsustainable, when you think the big conversation in the wake of the financial crisis has been capital, capital, and more capital for the big banks. You have these two companies with outstanding over $5 trillion worth of debt and operating on no capital. That sounds awfully unsustainable to me. Why aren't people talking about it? Why aren't politicians? Because I think it doesn't lend itself to an easy solution. So politicians want their talking points. Get rid of them! And then as soon as they learn a little bit more about the situation, they think, oh, it's complicated. And so then they stop talking about it. It's a great example of political dysfunction in the face of a complicated problem.
All right, so I know it's a complicated problem, but if you were to offer a solution on the back of a napkin, what would it be?
I have reluctantly come to the view that Fannie and Freddie are a little bit like Winston Churchill's famous line about democracy, the worst possible thing with the possible exception of everything else that's been considered. I was never a fan of these two companies, but when you start to look at what the alternatives are, the alternatives seem a lot worse. And just one quick point on that, there's this sort of false notion out there that there's private capital to fund the mortgage market. I'm not sure why anybody believes that the nation's big banks are purely private capital.
All right, and then finally, you have a lot of hedge fund managers trying to get rich off Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac right now. Do you think they'll do it?
Well, I think they've got a point. I think in common sense terms, what happened when the government abruptly changed the rules in the summer of 2012, not when we were in crisis, and said we're going to take 100% of the profits of these companies from now into eternity. That doesn't make sense to me in common sense terms. Doesn't mean the hedge fund managers are going to win in court, but I think if they do, that's actually another problem because it starts to tie the hands of the government in terms of what the solution can be if you've also got a court order about how investors have to get paid. So I wish the government would figure out a solution before they're forced to by the courts.
All right, thanks a lot, Bethany. Great book.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching The Street.